I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College, author of Leadership in American Academic Geography, the 20th Century, and host of Conversation with a Geographer, an oral history series devoted to an exploration of the roles played by scholars, mentors, and leaders who have shaped the geographic discipline, as well as those who practice the geographer's craft. This particular episode pays tribute to a leading figure in the history of geographic thought, while also tasking us to ponder not only the significance of our discipline's past, but the importance of presenting, for better or for worse, a truthful account of its history. Jeffrey J. Martin passed away at the age of 90 on 7 October 2024. He spent a lifetime examining correspondence held in various archives across the globe in an effort to gain understanding of the distinguished scholars and power wielders who shaped the history of geography. Their letters revealed clues that enabled him to frequently ascertain the thoughts of the discipline's leading figures, which provided insight into their intentions, decisions, and behaviors. Born in England in 1934, at 6 years of age, Jeff witnessed the Battle of Britain, and experiencing the horrors of war influenced him deeply. In delivering economic geography lectures, he would often challenge students to consider the ramifications of vast expenditures on defense. Guns or butter, he would often proclaim. In any event, the Second World War provided an avenue for geography to enter homes. Newspapers carried maps showing wartime events that proved invaluable in understanding the pace of war. Captivated by maps, Jeff acquired talent in cartographic analysis, a skill that would be employed later during a brief period of military service with the Scots Guards. But he credited his aunt, a grammar school principal, who fostered his interest in geography at an early age. At the age of 18, Jeff had gained admission to the London School of Economics and Political Science. When interviewed by the selection board, he was asked, "Why do you want to study geography at LSE?" He stammered a bit and delivered an unsatisfactory answer for at least one member of the committee, who barked loudly, "Say it, boy!" Intimidated by his inquisitor, Jeff quickly blurted out the real reason he chose LSE: "Because of Sir Lawrence Dudley Stamp, sir." Jeff went on to gain a bachelor's degree. Afterward, he took an additional year for a PGCE at King's College. Developing a relationship with Sidney Wooldridge, the first professor of geography at King's, proved to be a decisive factor in shaping future directions in his research. Regardless, Jeff left London and went off to the University of Florida for a master's degree in geography and work in Everglades reclamation. By the age of 25, he had accepted an assistant professor appointment at Eastern Michigan University.
Jeff liked to talk, and at least he liked to talk to me. And we had some rather extended phone calls, largely about his sadness, I would say, at the limited place the history of the discipline occupied in university curricula and in AAG. He really thought knowing where you were coming from was helpful in knowing where you were going as a profession. And I think he often thought that his efforts were underappreciated, not personally by me. I have always been fascinated by the history of geography, going back to the Greeks and so on. All professions need somebody like Jeff, and to some degree, at least as in my acquaintance, he's irreplaceable. As a scholar, I would say, and historian of the discipline. He was diligent and energetic beyond measure. He traveled as extensively as he could with limited support from the profession and from his institution, haunting the archives of countries in Europe, most of the countries in Europe and in the United States, looking for primary sources. I think Jeff's genius was his ability to ferret out correspondence and to tell the rest of us what the motivations of prominent geographers in Europe and especially were. Jeff gave us more insights about what was motivating scholars. He was a pack rat, and thank God for that. I would call him up once in a while and start talking about something in the history of either the AEG or the IGU, and we would chat about it for a bit, and he would say, well, I'll look at my garage and see what I've got about that. And several days later in the mail would come some gems of the history of the discipline that I had no idea existed, but Jeff had found them and carefully kept them away.
Jeff's publication record at Eastern was respectable. It included pieces on political geography and Mark Jefferson, African empowerment, French geographic thought, and a 120-page Atlas of Africa published by W.C. Brown and Company. In addition to research and teaching, he maintained expertise in chess. Jeff subscribed to chess magazines that came from behind the Iron Curtain. Naive in thinking that the opened envelopes in his departmental mailbox were simply the result of a standard practice in American universities, he found himself rather befuddled when he learned that a newly hired colleague informed the FBI that a communist was among the faculty in his department. And it happened to be him. Having been wounded during the invasion of Normandy, carried clout, so when John Lounsbury alleged that the young British professor was really a wolf in sheep's clothing, more evidence was not needed to exile him to a makeshift office in an upstairs loft, far removed from the rest of the department, and subsequently terminate his employment. Jeff became one of the many victims of McCarthyism and its aftermath. 25 years later, he would write, "It may be that a larger percentage of professional geographers were investigated than professionals of other disciplines." In 1965, after 6 years in Ypsilanti, Jeff found himself scrambling to find an academic appointment elsewhere. He'd already arranged for his forthcoming book on Mark Jefferson to be the inaugural publication of Eastern Michigan University Press. Continuing to work on the manuscript, he took an associate professor position in the Wisconsin State University system at Platteville, and a year later, he accepted an appointment at Southern Connecticut State College in New Haven. With the publication of Mark Jefferson, Geographer, in 1968, Southern President Hilton Bewley congratulated Jeff and informed him he was awarded tenure and promotion to full professor.
He was kind to people. He was go out of his way to help students and so forth. And most people get shunted into a narrow area, but he didn't. Breadth and depth of his major publications reflect that. It's just incredible.
I was writing my dissertation on John Kirtland Wright, the sometime librarian and director of the American Geographical Society. And at some point in that process, I was given Jeff's postal address, and I wrote to him to explain what I was doing, expecting maybe a polite reply, but no particular follow-up. But that was the start of a long correspondence and series of phone calls. He couldn't have been more helpful. He couldn't have been more willing to share his knowledge, his experience, the information that he had with me, which I think is kind of remarkable that someone would take that time to help out an undergraduate student from a different institution that they didn't know, that they hadn't been introduced to. And I think that was really a marker of his personality, incredible generosity and willingness to share his information. So we corresponded for a number of years and spoke on the phone from time to time. And he loved to talk. He loved to speak to people from all sorts of backgrounds and contexts. And I remember on one occasion, I was still living at home with my parents in those days. I came home to discover that he had called the house when I was not there and had spoken to my mum for 45 minutes about goodness knows what. Really happy to have someone to talk to share what he knew. And I got the impression of someone who had really encyclopedic knowledge, particularly of the history of American geography. And for me, that was absolutely invaluable insight, because very often it was coming from personal experience, people that he had met who were key figures in the early 20th century history of geography, who were still around at the time that he was starting his professional career, virtually all of whom he met. So he was able to provide me with really useful information about Wright, which was helpful for me to contextualize him as an individual, as a real person, rather than an abstract figure from the history of the discipline. And especially because I was in contact with Wright's children, who were still alive at that time. And the knowledge that Jeff was able to provide about him allowed me to write to them in a knowing and contextualized way. So he really did help guide me through that process. And, I'm hugely grateful for the time that he took to do that. So we kept in touch over the years. And when I started a PhD looking at the work of Ellen Churchill Semple, he again made himself endlessly available to answer questions and to provide advice. And I think we shared a particular, obsession with the archive as a key source of, or a proxy for truth, or at least for fact.
I first became acquainted with Dr. Martin's work through his extensive Bowman writing as a graduate student at Texas A&M University. Dr. Dan Sway, when he was at Texas A&M, taught the first course I had as a grad student, and that was the history and philosophy of geographic thought. And so that's where I first interacted with Dr. Martin and his work. As I moved on to my PhD work at Ohio State, I took the same course, History and Philosophy of Geographic Thought, from Dr. Kevin Cox, a bit of a Marxist bent. And what I realized was that I really appreciated these multiple kinds of ways to, or multiple lenses to explore the history of the discipline. And so, we used mostly journal articles, maybe an occasional chapter here or there.
All segments of the discipline should be concerned about their, subdisciplinary histories, and more widely about the entire discipline. Geography's history is not just what goes on in the academy, in the university. And we should be looking at what geographers are doing both inside as well as outside.
New Haven proved to be an optimal location for Jeff to conduct further research in the history of geography. Yale provided ample archival deposits for exploring the lives of Ellsworth Huntington and Isaiah Bowman. And the American Geographical Society in New York was only a train ride away, which also held an abundance of material on Bowman. As he sought to create prosopographies on these early leaders in American geography, Jeff explored the archives. After Ellsworth Huntington, His Life and Thought was published in 1973, he spent considerable time engaging in research on Bowman. His scholarship was respected, and he conversed easily with those who shaped the discipline. Among his colleagues in academic geography were members of an older generation, such as Preston James, Richard Hartshorne, J. Russell Whitaker, and Chauncey Harris. It was late in the decade, however, when Jeff's research was interrupted. As the Association of American Geographers' 75th anniversary celebration was scheduled to be held in 1979, the association's council decided all participants attending the annual meeting in Philadelphia would be given a copy of a book documenting the AAG's history. Preston James, who had been a member of the AAG since 1926, accepted authorship of the project. Unfortunately, James' vision deteriorated to the point of blindness, and he simply could not write. With little more than a year to go before the meeting, Jeff was approached to pick up the pieces. Although James was unable to do much, Jeff had help from Clyde Cohn and Harm DeBlay. Cohn agreed to write a chapter on the 1950s, and DeBlay committed to writing a chapter on the 1960s and 1970s. Still, it was a formidable task, especially with reference to the 1940s, which was a complicated decade for the association. From its founding in 1904 until the post-war period, the AAG had been an exclusive club. The membership requirements were so stringent, President Woodrow Wilson was denied entry into the association, and in comparison with other academic organizations, enrollments were few. By the end of the war, the AAG's 306 members amounted to less than 10% of the membership of the American Historical Association and the American Economics Association. Many geographers, finding themselves blackballed by the AAG, created the American Society for Professional Geographers, ASPG, led by F. Webster McBride. As the ASPG quickly totaled 1,094 members, it became recognized as a distinctive professional geographical organization that threatened the viability of the AAG. And in 1948, an amalgamation between the two organizations occurred. Although a new society with a new constitution was created, a vote took place to name this new organization the Association of American Geographers. This story needed to be told, but it was imperative for Jeff to chat with McBride. When he was contacted, McBride indicated he did not believe the anticipated James and Martin volume would present a truthful account of the events leading to the merger of the societies, and he was disinclined to contribute because he did not trust James. Over the course of 2 decades, James played a part as one of the association's principal gatekeepers, committed to denying membership to geographers who were not considered acceptable. And James was designated the lead author of the anniversary book. Jeff was challenged indeed. Repeatedly, he tried to convince McBride that James was blind and not able to write, and that the task at hand was entirely on Jeff's shoulders. His persistence paid off. McBride shared crucial details about the events leading to the merger, and the volume was completed with little time to spare. It was published by the AAG and made available to the participants at the Philadelphia annual meeting in 1979. In the following year, The Life and Thought of Isaiah Bowman was published, completing the triad Jeff had intended, representing what he said was the ontographic departure from Daviesian physiography in American geographic thought. He was also elected to AAG Council in 1980 for a 3-year term and awarded AAG honors in 1983.
I think the value of Jeff's perspective came from the fact that he was able to make connections and to surface things that were not necessarily obvious in the printed records of the history of the discipline. So, for example, the nature of personal relationships between individuals, for example, working at the American Geographical Society, personalities, clashes of personality, friendships, things that are not necessarily obvious in the printed sources, but can be pieced together from the private and the archival. Why is it that particular ideas come to the fore? Why are some championed? Why are some challenged? What does that reveal about the underlying, very often personal mechanisms that are at the heart of a discipline? It's not a discipline that operates solely on objective senses of what is valuable and not. It's a discipline that is built by people, and therefore it's interesting to think about the nature of those people, their relationships with one another, and the context of their interactions and what that then leads to.
The moment that I keep in my memory was the 2008 AAG meeting in Boston, when I was still a graduate student at LSU, and I was traveling there with my advisor, Kent Matthewson, and we shared a room with Jeff. So probably I was a kind of unaccounted guest in the hotel, but that was part of the deal. So this is how I met Jeff first. And my impression of him was that he was really this kind of traditional English gentleman, very traditional in his behavior, very, very British, if I can say this, very calm, dry humor.
I was interacting mostly with GIS people at the AAG meetings. And so in around 2017, as I was really ramping up my interest in publishing in this area, history and geography, I wanted to connect with Dr. Martin. I wanted to ask him a few questions. He held an extensive scholarly knowledge, certainly, but he seemed to know people. He really seemed to know people. So I reached out to the AAG to say, how do I get a hold of Dr. Martin? I can't find an email address for him. And they said, well, he doesn't have an email. You have to contact his son, Tad. So that's exactly what I did. I reached out to Tad, hoping that somehow I would connect with Dr. Martin. Tad responded right away and said, of course, you can chat with him. And I got his phone number, and then we arranged a phone call. And then we spent about 3 hours talking on the phone in that very first interaction. That was very, very typical for like every conversation we would have from then on.
With the AAG honors in his knapsack, as well as co-authorship with James of the second edition of All Possible Worlds, A History of Geographical Ideas, Jeff's status as the leader of geographic thought in North America was cemented. In 1984, in addition to giving a talk at the University of Texas, he delivered the Ralph H. Brown Memorial Lecture at the University of Minnesota, and he was awarded a National Geographic Society grant for his research, which was recognized by Gilbert Grosvenor in his plenary lecture at the AAG annual meeting in Washington, D.C. At the conference reception sponsored by John Wiley & Sons, Richard Hartshorne, Preston James, and Harm DeBlay were among those who greeted Jeff warmly. DeBlay informed Jeff that he was recently appointed the founding editor of National Geographic Research, and he asked him to submit to the new journal an article on geographic thought. The following year, appearing in the first volume of the journal, was Paradigm Change, a study of the history of geography in the United States, 1892 to 1925.
He was clearly seen as the doyen of historians of geography from the time when he became co-author of Preston James' standard text, All Possible Worlds, A History of Geographical Ideas, in its second edition in 1981.
Although graduate programs were not inclined to devote tenure-track lines exclusively to the history of geography, many departments expressed value in the subject, and some sought to have their doctoral students learn from Jeff. Kempton Webb hired him to teach a course on geographic thought at Columbia. Sam Hilliard arranged a schedule for Jeff to teach a course at Louisiana State University, and Roland Fuchs offered Jeff a visiting appointment at the University of Hawaii. In this way, Jeff was able to reach beyond the undergraduate classrooms at Southern and discuss the evolution of the discipline with future academicians. With the Jefferson-Huntington-Bowman triad completed, Jeff's principal energy then turned to his magnum opus, an effort devoted to the history of geography in North America, which he anticipated would take more than a decade to complete. And several colleagues in the discipline, including Chauncey Harris and John Fraser Hart, wrote letters to support his candidacy for AAG vice president. The nominating committee was convinced he should be one of two candidates, and its members honored Jeff by selecting him. In 1997, Jeff lost to William Graff, an exemplary geomorphologist at Arizona State University. Jeff continued to contribute to scholarship in the history of geography. He reviewed several books for academic journals relating to the history of geography, and in 2005, the fourth edition of All Possible Worlds was published, in which he served as the sole author. The book was rightfully considered a colossal achievement. But Jeff's disinclination toward legitimizing studies in the history of geography with reference to Latin America, and his failure to incorporate much-needed discussion of the role of women in geography was evident. Despite his advanced years, he continued to devote much time to his scholarship. He also spent hours on the telephone in discussion with interested students, colleagues, and archivists, freely sharing bits and pieces of knowledge he'd collected over the decades. At the age of 80, his magnum opus was published, American Geography and Geographers Toward Geographical Science, was published in 2015. Ron Abler remarked, "Geographers who do not take the time to engage the discipline's history that Martin has so effectively portrayed impoverish themselves and their students." Of this, there is little doubt. Yet Charles Withers expressed a valid concern that Jeff's unwillingness to incorporate and address others' more recent scholarship of wider conceptual and interpretive thinking diminishes the book. And Lavery's comment that a principal shortcoming of the book rested in its lack of in-depth theoretical analysis, which was largely characterized as being more of a catalog of people, places, and problems, a detailed narrative of events rather than a critical review. Despite these minor faults, American Geography and Geographers Toward Geographical Science was considered an important contribution to the discipline by all reviewers.
Perhaps the capstone of my association with Jeff was having the pleasure, as editor of the AAG Review of Books, of organizing a special session at the Chicago meeting of the AAG in 2015. It honored Martin and the publication of his own 2014 capstone. The panelists included Dorothy Sack for physical geography, Brian Bluet for political, Ron Abler for institutional, and Charles Withers for historical, with summary remarks by Martin. The commentaries were published as a review essay in the AAG Review of Books. For a time, it led the list of most read and most cited. It is clear that Jeffrey Martin's talents, industry, and above all, encyclopedic knowledge of the field are not likely to ever be duplicated. In the course of more than 5 decades of research, he visited 17 countries, consulted 300 archival holdings, accumulated well over 100,000 manuscripts, and personally corresponded with more than 100 people.
I came to know him quite quickly after starting at the AGSL because he was working on his book and would call on a very regular basis, looking for things, asking all sorts of questions, and generally wanting to talk. He was well known among my staff, and we learned his phone number because when we saw Jeff calling, we had to make sure we had enough time if we picked up the phone because we knew once we picked up that phone, we were going to be there for at least 15, 20, 30, 40 minutes. And it was really initially through those phone conversations that I got to know Jeff. I loved answering the phone when he called because I knew that I was in for a treat. I knew that I would learn something. I knew that if I had any questions pending about some piece of geographic history that we were working on trying to help somebody find, I could ask him those questions. But it really was a treat to just listen to him talk about all of the things that he talked about, but really for me, the history of geography components to it. He also developed a really nice friendship with one of our staff members, Kay Gildner. And if I couldn't answer the phone, I would like scream out my office for Kay to answer the phone because she would take the time. And so she was the second person in line when we saw the call coming in. If I couldn't take it, Kay would take it. And she worked really closely with Jeff's son, Tad, also in helping trying to like find the things that Jeff was looking for in writing the book. For the work that I do in helping people study the history of geography and the history of cartography, there are two books that I would consider like the Bibles. It's Geography in the Making by J.K. Wright. We have to use that almost on a daily basis because it provides us the history of the AGS. And we each have a volume of that book in our offices that has all kinds of like sticky notes in it so we can find the things that we quickly need to find. And the other book is Jeff's book, which I have here, American Geography and Geographers. This is my personal copy that he signed and gave to me, which I keep at home. But my work copy is well loved and well used, equally with a number of marks in it and notes and pages that I go back to on a regular basis. Jeff publishing this book, it was very significant, certainly for the history of geography, but for people studying the history of geography, what he has done is compile that history. But I think the other really tremendous and helpful to us as librarians and probably researchers as well thing that he did was he went to all of these places and consulted all of these archives and wrote down what he found and where he found it, so that when I'm helping somebody, I go to Jeff's book. Jeff probably wrote about this whatever topic. Where did he find that information? So it's almost, or really it is, a bibliography of the history of geography also. And where are the important collections and what is in there? And I think that has been so valuable on so many levels to us in the AGSL that I can't even imagine anymore not having this book, because we consult it at least on a weekly basis, looking for some answers or some guidance on where we can find those answers.
I think something that I would like to add about Jeff is he was really the reference for the history of academic geography, not only United States and also in the world. So he was some kind of connector between the old-fashioned and a new approach to the history of geography. At the same time, he was also an eyewitness of the making of geography in the 20th century. So some people will say, so what Jeff did is maybe out of date today when we discuss the history of geography. And I totally do not agree with this, because his focus was on people and not on processes. So I see some kind of tendency, trend in the history of geography to think more about, well, events and processes that kind of characterize the specific times. You think about, for example, recent projects on Black geographies in the history of geography in the United States.
In essence, Jeff served as the de facto gatekeeper, documenting the history of geography in the United States. Looking backward, he selected the personalities, events, and other matters considered for inclusion and exclusion in recording the discipline's history and making it available to the geographical community. So it should not be a surprise that he accorded to women and people of color short shrift in his writing. They were largely excluded from leadership roles in academic geography for the first 8 decades of the AAG's existence. Yet women and people of color played important roles in the discipline as faculty, students, staff in geographical societies, and professional geographers in government service. Jeff was not the only historian of our craft that was aware of the contributions of some, if not several, and their exclusion from the history of geography is shameful. Not only are these stories that must be told, but the discipline needs geographers with the will to engage in the scholarship necessary to fill the voids that have been left open by past gatekeepers of our discipline's history.
It brings me to a question, right? How can we know if and how advancement and change has occurred in geographical thought without an extensive investigation of the past? I mean, how can we know if we're advancing, if we're improving? How can we know these things? And also, how can we know like what is owned by geography, right? What is original thought in geography, or are some of the things shared or borrowed from other places? Without this kind of investigation, it might not be really possible for us to know this. And so just in terms of even thinking about this investigation in geography, but really the history of science, how can we know this?
I think there's probably 3 ways of thinking about the value of interrogating, or at least being concerned about, the history of geography. I think the first one is that we live with the legacy of what's happened in the past. So we think about the structures of our discipline, professional organizations, the areas of intellectual interest, the concepts and methods that we use, the questions that we ask as geographers. They are the products of an accumulation of previous decisions and debates. And I think if we are curious and critical scholars, it behoves us to understand some of that context so we can make sense of why it is that we now are interested in these things, these questions, and using these particular methods. So I think there's a sort of basic requirement for us as scholars to be concerned about how did we get to where we are now, and what are some of the consequences of those legacies, of the choices and decisions made in the past for what we do now as geographers. I think the other one is that in various ways, geography and geographical knowledge have been historically implicated in imperialist and racist forms of knowledge production. And again, if we're serious about the positive contributions that geography can make in the future, we do have to deal with the legacies of that, to think about the types of voices that have been included and excluded historically in the discipline, why that has happened, and what we need to do to challenge that. And I think the third one is that there's a sort of pedagogical value in teaching and understanding something about the history of geography. So from students' perspectives, I think it's very valuable to see the conceptual ideas that they encounter, that they're learning about, not as abstract things that somehow popped into the world, but as products of particular people and places and periods within the discipline. It seems to me that in some ways, Jeff represents the end of a particular tradition of scholarship, a focus on meticulous detail that is very difficult for scholars today to be able to replicate under the changing conditions in which we all operate. We all have more pressure put on us seemingly less time to do our jobs, and it's very difficult to commit ourselves to the detail and depth of scholarship that Jeff was able to produce. And I think in many ways he was geography's equivalent to Robert Caro, Lyndon Johnson's biographer, who committed himself and has committed himself to a lifetime scholarship to understand something that is important to all of us, really. So I think in the work that I try and do in the future, I'm trying to carry forward a little bit of some of the lessons that I've learned from Jeff, the commitment to facts, the commitment to the archive as an essential part in the chain of evidence, and a sense that it's important to turn every page as far as is possible to really understand what it is to be a geographer and what it is to inherit the legacy of a discipline.
Jeff had certainly cultivated my interest in the history of geographic thought, and it was through him that I had the opportunity to engage in conversations with Preston James, Richard Hartshorne, and Harm DeBlay. I also had many long talks with Wes Dow and Salvatore Natoli, and some significant dialogues with Chauncey Harris, John Fraser Hart, Sam Hilliard. Bill Kelch also provided a valuable perspective, as did Jeff's colleagues at Southern, Martin Glassner, Leon Yatcher, and Danny Gonzalez. So what I share is drawn not only from my interactions with Jeff, but also insight I've gained from others. Jeff has earned a special place of recognition, especially for his scholarship and service as the AAG archivist for more than 3 decades. For to say that he did much for the history of geography is an understatement. But our discipline deserves a fair and balanced and truthful account, for better or for worse, of noting not just the merits of those that played important parts in our history, but also their imperfections. Despite the many accolades Jeff warrants, his own biases and inclinations played a role in masking important aspects of our discipline's history, and his transactional behavior at times did little to enhance the status of geography. Indeed, Jeff was known throughout the discipline, and he had developed a network of colleagues and confidants, which did not make it seem unreasonable that he would have a chance of winning the election for AAG vice president. Being selected by the nominating committee was evidence of that. He wrote the organization's history, he served on a standing committee, he served on council, and he also often lent insight to members of the central office staff, as well as those in leadership positions. But Jeff had also alienated a number of active AAG members, or among other things, in concentrating on developing relationships with geographers of an earlier and largely patriarchal era. His misogynistic viewpoints and comments were not unknown. This contempt was noticed by women scholars in the discipline who had struggled to achieve parity with men. Still, he exercised generosity on many occasions, particularly with reference to assisting young scholars conducting research in geographic thought. Indeed, like so many geographers in academe, Jeff was complicated. It's reasonable to think that he could have done more, but it's important to realize, too, that all he accomplished likely could not be emulated. In closing, it is appropriate to reflect on a 1978 Geographers on Film episode. In response to Wes Dow's query, if he thought gaining an understanding of the discipline's history was important for geography students, Jeff responded, "A little reminiscence, a little recognition, not to go hagiographic and worship these people, but to look at them as they were and give them their credit and their due. They were the people that made the field what it was." Certainly, this slightly unvarnished tribute is not hagiographical, yet Jeffrey Martin not only deserves credit for his scholarship, but for in many ways shaping the history of geographic thought to what it is today. In search of understanding the path our discipline has trod, he was unmatched in passion and talent for traversing archives across the globe. He was indeed the doyen of the field. It seems unlikely there will ever be another.